Hey, welcome back to Mobility WOD. I want to talk for a second about a phenomenon we're seeing culturally from physical therapy into strength training. And that really is this question that somehow our communities are really flexion averse when we're talking about spinal movements and spinal mechanics. And the result is that we've seen a resurgence in a very old movement called the Jefferson curl, which has been advocated by coaches forever and ever. And if you're not familiar, a Jefferson curl is basically allowing the spine to come to its end ranges of flexion with a load and then returning back up. And what ends up happening is that it's one of those movements that ends up being very polarizing. And people are saying, hey, we shouldn't load the spine in flexion. We should only load the spine in quote unquote neutral. And what we want to do is make sure that we can sort of unpackage this conversation and really show you that good training actually isn't flexion averse. In fact, good training normalizes flexion because flexion is part of the language of the human spine, especially in athletics and especially in normal movement. The problem is if we don't have a formal language to describe spinal motion or say when is it more appropriate, less appropriate, are we doing it actively, passively? Do I deflect and fatigue into flexion? Do I translate into flexion under load? Then the language starts to become a little more complicated. One of the things that we want to make sure we understand though is that there's absolutely a place for flexion and that normal range of motion of the joint, in fact the joints around the spine can only be classified as normal if they can handle flexion loads and extension loads under some additional pressure. So let me give you a quick example. So if I grab Ryan here, one of the things that I would do as a physio to assess his normal lumbar competency and to make sure it wasn't a problem and he had a healthy back is that I would have him, just take a step towards me, I would have him just fold round down and touch your toes, round, let yourself round, tuck your chin, and not only would I say, hey, this should be normal, but I should be able to overpress him and push him into loaded lumbar flexion, even through the head, in order for that to be considered a normal healthy back. Thank you. So if we're looking at range of motion of any one of the joints, what we can say is that if I have incomplete joint mechanics in extension or flexion, either side of that range, it's a dysnormal joint, or I have atypical motion, which could lead me to compensation strategies. The problem is when we become apologetic about our flexion language, that we're saying, hey, we don't know how to stop flexion, or our athletes don't have a language around good transferable mechanical advantage or good sort of geometry of the spine, that we start to become a little bit perilous in our thinking, because then we're saying, well, I don't know how to stop flexion and flexion's normal, so that flexion must be okay. You cannot walk into any serious strength conditioning movement facility on the planet and show up with a rounded back deadlift or a big rounded squat and end up setting a world record. And what I want to do is shift away from the conversation again of don't do this because you might get injured, because flexion is not only normal, but it's regularly trained in the environment. And what I want to do though is also move this conversation into what positions translate load and force more effectively. But to begin this conversation, first, I want to make sure that we are understanding a couple key differences around the spine. So typically in the language of the spine, this straight up and down or braced position that usually we run in, that we hinge in, that we swing in, that we jump in, this language has been traditionally classified as neutral. And the difficulty with that is that everyone has slightly different shapes of spines, we have different lengths of spines, our processes look different, our heads are in slightly different positions. So classifying what a normal or neutral spine is tricky and troublesome at best. What we know is that if I squeeze my butt and my rib cage is down, then I'm going to achieve a more organized spinal shape that handles axial loads through the spine this direction much more efficiently. So if I'm looking at creating a language of spinal motions that I'm looking for my patients and athletes to be able to adopt, we're looking is can they get into a braced, organized spinal shape that allows them to handle and transfer loads maximally, and that translates most of the sports, and that is this basic organized position. And don't get me wrong, this will work as well, but we know that actually this is not as effective at handling loads, even though it can handle loads very well. And traditionally what you're going to see is that when I go from flexion or to extension of the spine, the end ranges of the joints making this global flexion or global extension, this is typically how we're describing the motion restoring flexion. Of course, in the language of mobility WOD, we're saying, hey, what we want to avoid are these moments where I have increased flexion or increased extension around specific spots, because what's happening is that I'm no longer in global flexion, I'm in localized flexion, which causes not a transference of good energy through the system globally, but I have one segment that's doing a lot more work than the rest of the segments. And what we know is that this is a surefire dysfunction in loss of position and power. So we're talking about wattage and output. Again, we're not talking about will this lead me to be susceptible to injury or not. We're trying to step away from that language and step away from that thinking to say, one, normal flexion of the spine it shows up in a lot of movements, and two, we're trying to make sure that when we do load those, you'll see that the language of the movement in the gym is typically in movements that don't have large axial loads through the spine this way. Why? Because if you receive a heavy clean in this position, it turns out it's not as effective as receiving a heavy clean in this position. And if you don't believe me, let's go to the Olympics and look at all the world records, and I guarantee you, you're not going to see many heavy cleans in this position. You'll see heavy cleans received. Why? Because this system allows for better function of the hips and shoulders and better energy transfer through the human organism, whether or not that ends up being an issue of injury or not. So what we're going to do now is take you on a quick tour of some of the motions around flexion that are part of the movement lexicon, the movement vocabulary of every good gym. Now again, what one of my beefs is, if we're thinking, hey, we're spending a lot of time in these brace positions and we're flexion averse, let's make sure that that's actually a true statement, because what we know unequivocally, those of us who work in gyms and are in complete training systems, we flex the spine a lot and we train loaded flexion a lot. What I'll tell you is that we don't teach loaded flexion in our primary big power heavy lifting. Why? Because we find that those movements don't transfer to more skills, that these dead end rounded shapes then don't translate into an open-ended possibility. Secondarily, I just want to remind you once again that there is a big gap in the number and the diversity and the quality of movements that I can expose to people, besides you always have to be braced, you always need to be neutral, and Jefferson curls.
So at this point, you've clearly come to understand that we believe that normal spines end up in flexed positions all the time. To the extent that we should be able to distinguish between a moment or a skill where I should have a organized, stiffened appropriately spine, and when I need to be able to bend like a reed in the wind, for lack of a better word, is clearly a lifelong skill. So you saw that we did a lot of movements in the gym where we're teaching and reflecting the normalization of spinal movement as part of a flexion language, as part of the daily training. So again, one of the things we want to point out with is that I don't think as a strength and conditioning community we're spinal averse. On the contrary, I think we treat spinal flexion as a normal part of the system. In fact, what we continue to say is that if your spine can't flex, you're going to have a problem. The degree of your flexion obviously depends on your sport, and you still need to be able to know when to flex and when to be stiff. So what I wanted to show you though is that you may recognize yourself in some of the shapes that we see in the gym, but I also want to show you that even in the top level of athletes, we see regularly positions where we see a lot of spinal flexion. And that's a component to the natural sport that we're in. And that when you start getting into it, you'll recognize that for better or for worse, that we can safely load and flex the spine. This is just the greatest American, cross-country skier of all time in a flexion position, because sometimes it's impossible for us to normalize and be in a stiffened shape, and we can't handle that. So one of the things that we can do though unequivocally is see if can we mitigate those shapes, can we idealize those shapes, big water challenge. But you'll find that a lot of times it's impossible for us based on the task at hand, based on the skill involved, for us to actually be able to maintain excellent lumbar alignment. So the key then is, well, hey, do I have the language of flexion? Can I still be stiff in these positions? Go World Cup. And the idea here is that once you start to be able to see this, then what you can begin to ask yourself is, hey, is this part of my programming? And it doesn't have to be rounded back deadlift or loaded Jefferson curl as your first foray into this language. But absolutely, you'll see that if you don't have spinal flexion as part of your movement training, when you have to go violently end up in a position of spinal flexion, this may be a problem. So again, don't be spinal flexion averse. Understand that being able to have full functioning hips means that when I get translated into flexion, I'm not so loaded in those difficult positions at end range accidentally. When I go to pick something heavy up off the ground, that spinal flexion is a choice and not a mandate.